paperwork is more efficient and not as voluminous. Are there any examples around the world you can follow?
One example is with the Scientific Experimental Research and Development Program, the SHRED program. The forms, there's one specific tax form that's very complicated for SMEs to fill out. I think reducing the redundancy and looking at forming like check boxes and being able to is one aspect of it where it's simply yes or no instead of having to fill out a ton of information. I think that's one aspect of it. I think two is helping them have resources they need. So like toolkits. Is another thing. And then you look at having like different, where it's in the case for the SHRED program, the Canada Revenue Agency helps deal with compliance and auditing, like making it easier for like customer service to be established for them to be able to be compliant. I think that includes improving compliance training, but then also getting different, compliance officers to meet with manufacturers to understand.
Merci, monsieur. Je vais laisser un peu de temps à Madame Jones, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. I'd like Ms. Jones to answer as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're pointing out that there's lots of opportunity to simplify without undermining the objectives, and certainly paperwork forms. That's something that we heard a lot about at the External Advisory Committee. And I think our advice on that was really that we think that every department, every agency needs to get very focused on what they can do. And leadership is one of the things that's really important. I mean, there are lots of priorities in government, but I think that this one deserves to be a priority. And last thing I would say is you don't need to look around the world for good examples. Nova Scotia is doing a great job of this, as the example I've shared on the doctors. They're also looking at housing and other things. I think just about any priority of government that you can imagine can be made better by trying to simplify some of the unnecessary burden.
Mr. Bachrach, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Greco, I was somewhat stunned that you weren't able to address my question about wealth inequality and income inequality, because these are widely held economic concerns. Does the Chamber of Commerce have a position or a perspective on the impact of widening wealth and income inequality in Canada?
We want equality for all. At the end of the day, there has to be equality and fairness for all.
And do any of the policies that you've been advocating for today contribute to greater equality when it comes to wealth equality or income equality?
All our policies that we put forward are for the interests of all Canadians. Yes, we are a business organization. We are a business organization, but everything that we put forward as an organization is about for the prosperity of all Canadians and to ensure that Canadians' interests are protected.
But certain kinds of growth, for instance, contribute to greater inequality. And so, the World Bank has expressed concern that if that's the direction that countries go in, they're not going to be able to sustain that growth, and they're not going to be able to sustain social stability, because widening inequality is corrosive on society, and we've seen that all around the world. I guess specific to this issue because this is the question when it comes to capital gains. This is the nub of the issue, is that the tax code and the way that we've structured taxes have worsened the issue of income and wealth equality in this country. And so trying to reverse that means making changes to make it better. Do you not support those changes, given what we know about inequality?
Making changes, that's why I've talked about earlier and I'll repeat it again, is that's why comprehensive tax reform is important, to focus on best outcomes, not only for businesses to grow, but to help for the prosperity for all Canadians. If we don't have jobs, we have no investment, we don't have growing communities, and we're not improving our standard around the world.
Are any of the tax reforms that your organization advocates for connected to reducing wealth and income inequality? And is there any evidence that you can table that?
We are focused on equality and fairness for all Canadians.
Equality and fairness for all Canadians.
Very much. Okay. Mr. Moretz, please.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Greco, I wanted to spend a little more time on Mr. Beatty's letter, because it's quite interesting. He says the part where he talks about the the inclusion rate will only affect a small number of Canadians is misleading. He goes on to say 1 in 5 Canadian companies are likely to be directly impacted over the next 10 years, and the effects of this tax hike will be borne by all Canadians, directly or indirectly, either through diminishing creation of new companies and jobs, reducing the availability of medical practitioners, eroding pension returns, altering the delicate risk-reward balance of countless investments, or threatening the retirement plans of millions of Canadians who pin their plans on the proceeds of selling a family cottage or a small business grown over a lifetime. It's a pretty damning statement about the government's plan. Would you agree with the characterization that this is economic vandalism on the part of the Liberal government?
I think at the end of the day, though, it goes back to, again, we need to have this is a nonpartisan comment I want to stress that we need to have fairness in the tax system for all Canadians. And right now, I think, again, when you have tax expense carve out policies, that just is a signal to the rest of the world. What do we do in terms of investment in Canada?
Yeah, and speaking of fairness, I want to return back to this example because I don't think we spent enough time on it. My colleagues around this table, other than the Conservatives, don't seem to recognize that a small business can be incorporated. Like the example I gave of the hair salon that's a sole proprietorship, right next door to the hair salon that happens to be incorporated. Just a small company that maybe they went to a lawyer to do up for them so they could rent space through a company, maybe because they wanted to limit their liability, like people do. Those two people are treated differently. How is that fair?
I think at the end of the day, there has to be fairness for all Canadians, and I just think that when we can't be pitting groups against one or the other. It has to be fair for all, and I think that's a challenge with when we have these different policies. It shouldn't be dividing people. We have to be able to unite people in order to ensure that not only businesses thrive but also Canadians thrive as well.
Mr. Beatty goes on to say that the tax hike will only undermine the government's stated policy objectives, bolstering healthcare and dental care, attracting and retaining skilled professionals, increasing investment innovation, and helping small businesses thrive. So you couldn't have a more damning position of the government's policy, and yet it seems to be falling on deaf ears. Now, I was heartened to hear you say earlier that before the implementation legislation is tabled, that the Canadian Chamber of Commerce will be being proactive about this, and hopefully that enough pressure will come over the summer, like it did with the over the nighttime in the dark of night changes to the TOSI rules back in 2017, that the government ended up having to back off on. I suspect that a similar thing is going to happen over the summer when small businesses, wake up and realize that they're getting screwed over by the government again. But do you believe that the Chamber of Commerce will be mounting an exercise to push the government into withdrawing these changes?
Let's continue with advocacy. Our position is our position that was in the letter, and we continue to push advocacy for those changes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Mr. Baines, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to go back to growth of business and talk about red tape and regulatory reforms. And I'm going to dedicate this round to British Columbia. My dear colleague here will be sharing some of my time, and I will ask my question to Ms. Jones. You recently provided recommendations to the Treasury Board on regulatory competitiveness. Can you maybe share some of those recommendations, maybe the top few, and then I'll cede my time to Mr.
I mean, the top ones that I would like to highlight is, first of all, that we need a kind of a North Star, an idea of what it is we want our regulatory system to do. And I think too often we equate more rules with better protection, fewer rules with less protection, and that's sometimes the case, but not always the case. So we spend a lot of time talking about what regulatory excellence looks like, and we think that Canadians benefit from high standards. Certainly our products are very marketable around the world because they're seen as coming from a jurisdiction that has high standards. That's important. But of course, we want to minimize the drag on productivity and wasting people's time, that unnecessary rules have. So that regulatory excellence is the first recommendation. Second, I just want to come in again. We need better measurement. I mean, we wouldn't think on the fiscal side of not having really good measures, a budget that's tabled that we can debate and argue about, numbers that are readily available. We don't have that on the regulatory side. We need better measures to support striving towards regulatory excellence. And then, we heard a lot from different people about plain language, about just making sure that they're in constant conversation with the people who are regulated, not just before a regulation goes into place, doing a kind of one and done kind of consultation, but also making sure you're then following up and how are we achieving the desired outcomes? Are there things we need to change? Are there burdens we could reduce? Are there things we need to do better? And in some cases, are there areas where we're not regulating enough and we need to do more in order to protect Canadians? These are all important questions, and they deserve more attention than they're getting.
Well, thank you, Mr. Baines. And I just want to say a quick hello to Ms. Jones. It's been a long time since we sat across the table chatting about taxation and things. I wanted to talk about productivity again. Mr. Greco, I'll aim this at you. A chap by the name of Peter Phillips, who's a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of Saskatchewan School of Public Policy. He wrote something in the Globe and Mail a few days ago. Don't know if you're familiar with that. But I think it's a good place to look. I don't expect actually to have an answer to this, but on the record, just to, it's intelligence that gives us a spot to look at. He said, let's start with productivity. And he mentioned two professors at McMaster University. And they concluded, these two professors, that Canada's stagnation in productivity in the past 20 years is almost entirely because of the oil industry. Where they came up with that, I don't know, but it's worth looking at. They said when netted out, the oil components of the economy, and they netted that out and looked at productivity in the rest of the economy, they found that it rose about the same rate as in the past and compared favorably with the United States. So again, something to look at. But one thing I would like your reflection on, Mr. Greco, is that there should be some rules about rollover. Okay, so you realize a capital gain, but you turn right around and you reinvest it. What kind of advice would you give to the government about how to construct those rules so that somebody who's making an honest effort to build a business and using the proceeds of their investments, et cetera, don't necessarily get swept up in this?
Yeah, I think one of the things that would just help with productivity. So if you look at Atlantic Canada, for example, they introduced an investment tax credit of 10% to help improve, like with reinvesting machinery equipment, environmental performance, and other avenues to help out, like with what we're talking about, to address productivity. I think look at that and having, specific measures where it's easy for small businesses to be able to invest in that would help, but also making sure there are strict rules so nobody gets swept into, different challenges would be, I think, one thing. Secondly, though, from my perspective, again, I think the simplest way is what I talked about in my remarks, is look at these reforms to the regulatory system and look at the tax system. That would just go a long way to improve our productivity numbers.
Thanks, Mr. Hardy. Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I do appreciate the opportunity to have a round of questioning, even though I've only been here for the last hour. I would have to say it's a bit ironic that today's study on regulatory modernization was put forward by the Liberals on this committee with a view to doing a few things, which is reducing the unnecessary administrative burden on small and medium-sized businesses, simplifying regulatory processes, cutting red tape, and lastly, examining regulations that may impede international competitiveness. And yet here we are. They've introduced yet another, what I would call vacuous policy, with their increase in capital gains that is going to have a huge impact on the members you represent. I think I've heard that in the short time that I've been here today. And put that together with the carbon tax that is already hurting small and medium-sized businesses and the increases that are going to be contemplated all along the way. I know, Mr. Greco, that you had asked to return to this committee, that you've been here before, provided some testimony and asked if you could come back, and you said there were some things that you wanted to address. If I'm covering ground that was already covered in the first hour, I don't want to do that, but I'm thinking that you probably talked a lot about the capital gains policy of this current government. Is there anything that that is really pressing that you would like to share with us today, given that you had asked to return?
Yeah, and also just for to be also clear, I know Mr. McCauley had mentioned that he wanted myself and others back in June, just given the fact that we didn't get into hardly. I think one thing I really want to highlight is what's been done in going back to regulatory reform is what's been happening in British Columbia. So what they did is look at having a minister of deregulation, and that kind of helped separate to really put a focus on red tape. And then government agencies had to work on tracking and reporting regulatory activity against a baseline. Furthermore, agencies were put on a regulatory diet where they, in addition to looking at measurement and monitoring, they had to commit to reducing regulatory requirements by 1/3. And so that was tied into agencies having to demonstrate, why regulations would be introduced in exchange for any new regulations. New regulations that were introduced held greater scrutiny to demonstrate, how many regulations would be eliminated, but also focus on outcomes-based measures, evidence, a risk-based approach focusing on outcomes. Reform was decentralized, where each agency was responsible for tracking and reporting and monitoring progress. Why I mention this is we're looking at reforms to what Treasury Board is doing. These are things that we have to keep in mind, and especially when regarding to consultation. Yes, one and done consultation has been talked about, but it's also looking at roadmaps and looking at that progress. And if there isn't those proper work plans in place, then we don't have authentic consultation. It's going to be like, okay, we talked about it, and then we moved on. I think we really, with this study, we don't want this to be a study and just to sit on a study we're done. There needs to be this reform, and we have to move it forward. Otherwise, we're spinning our wheel, or we're spinning our wheels.
Thank you very much. Do I have any time left? Yeah, a minute and a half. I want to turn back to the Red Tape Reduction Act and the fact that at the last meeting we had around this, we had some witnesses around the table that weren't necessarily very familiar with some of the requirements in that act on the part of the government and the president of the Treasury Board to table an annual report on federal regulatory management initiatives and to provide an update on what the government is doing. And have you heard from many of your members on this issue that they may not have a full understanding about what is required of this government when it comes to the act? And given your mandate in representing your members, is there any advice you would provide to us on that front?
That's a great question. I think generally there's a lot of education that needs to be done still. And it goes back to explaining what different initiatives are in plain language. But part of that too, when you're explaining, we talk about cost-benefit analysis all the time. Yes, it's based on data made available in terms of regulatory impact analysis, what's available on StatsCan, but it's really going into how this affects businesses. They have to deal with different things in terms of compliance costs, operational costs, payroll, other technical requirements. That all has to be accounted for. Otherwise, if an initiative is put forward in terms of the Red Tape Reduction Act, there's not accountability. It's not really painting the whole picture. It has to look at everything: economic, environmental, societal considerations. Otherwise, we're not looking at what is not only the best interest for businesses, but we're also not looking at what is the best interest for Canadians.
Thanks very much. Mr. Sousa, please.
Thank you, Chairman. My question is to Laura Jones. So let's talk a little bit about the regulatory bodies. And there's been a lot of chatter from opposing views that politicians should be the one making decisions, it seems, when it comes to matters in case of regulatory matters like provincial regulatory affairs around securities law. Sometimes I've seen certain politicians get into the decision making of a securities regulator, especially when it comes across innovative engagement. The Bank of Canada, for example, is another area where politicians are making claims that they want to be the governor and promote other forms of currency, it seems. And I'm just wondering from your vantage point, how do you see the integrity of the system, especially that of Canadian and the regulatory side and the legitimate side? I mean, people come to Canada for certain reasons, and one of them is that they're safe from interference. I'd like to know your thoughts on the arm's length relationships of regulatory authorities.
I think we're fortunate to live in a country where we have, good institutions and standards around that. And of course, important that we're always mindful of that and having healthy debates and conversations about that is part of it. But respecting those boundaries, you mentioned the one between the Bank of Canada and I mean, there are healthy boundaries that have been set up for good reasons, and respecting that is important. We certainly didn't hear a lot of concern about that, if that's your question. With respect to the people who were coming to talk to us at the External Advisory Committee on Regulatory Competitiveness. That wasn't high on the list of things that people were that wasn't on the list. In fact, I don't think we had anyone raise that specifically.
I am concerned about competitiveness. I think all of us wants to lessen the cumulative burden of regulatory initiatives, but in order for our companies and institutions to be competitive, especially when they're competing with other parts of the world. I think that's one of the reasons we're having this discussion. But there's some safety codes that we want. They're voluntary standards that are provided by industry. And I think sometimes we equate that to regulatory issues. Do you distinguish between those?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to be a little bit more nuanced about this. It isn't always the case that reducing regulatory burdens is going to increase competitiveness. In some cases, our competitiveness is enhanced by the fact that people have a lot of faith in Canadian products being safe and healthy. And I know that gets advertised, for example, in Asian markets around some of our fishery and agriculture products. That's a huge competitive advantage that they come from Canada, a country that's known for its health and safety. So, but at the same time, we can't always equate more rules with more safety either. So it's finding that regulatory excellence.
I agree with you. I believe that's a fine balance in order to protect people's safety while being competitive. Mr. Greco, in 2008, we had a huge global financial meltdown. How did you feel about Canada during that time? How did you feel about our financial institutions during that time of that downturn?
Yeah, like at our time, I think our financial institutions were resilient. I think we're resilient. I think it was through a bipartisan effort of what happened with efforts of the Ontario government, the federal government as well, getting out. It was as a result of the efforts. I think in a nonpartisan way got us out of that financial crisis.
And we had certainly a manufacturing crisis, and we had to renew and to regroup and bring back a lot of employment, and we did. In fact, a lot more employment came back, a lot more manufacturing was reinvested into Canada, and especially in the auto industry, because of some of the collaboration of governments and in regulatory affairs when it came to protecting the financial services industry and consumers. Would you agree with that?
I remember in Ontario when we did pension reform, for example, that was definitely I think a positive step in the right direction. But I think though, Mr. Sousa, there was challenges with manufacturing though. Even going back as far as even like 4 or 5, 6 years ago, like it wasn't all perfect either in terms of the loss of manufacturing jobs and also where we're at in terms of sustained economic growth.
And I'm talking about
That's our time, I'm afraid.
Recovery. Thank you.
Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Jones. Ms. Pullman is one of the witnesses that appeared on April 10th. She told us that it was important to distinguish various regulations from one another. For example, there are regulations that are necessary, for example, in health and security. There are regulations or kinds of regulations that might be unjustified and might represent a burden, and therefore an unjustified burden on companies, be they a small, medium-sized, or large companies. How do you distinguish between a necessary form of regulation that is justifiable and one that becomes an unjustifiable burden on a company? What is the threshold that allows us to distinguish one from the other?
Another very good question. I think in some cases it's obvious. So when we look at the Nova Scotia example I gave earlier, employers, doctors, patients, everyone was agreeing that these sick note requirements were not adding any value, and they were taking a lot of time. So that's an example of obvious. Sometimes your definition of what's needed might be my definition of red tape, and that's where you get into healthy debate. But I think in all cases, it's important to say, what is the objective that we are trying to achieve? And is this particular set of rules, is it doing that effectively? And so if we go back to those kind of first principles and we look at data and evidence, then that's very helpful. We can also look at where things are duplicative. So if we have 2 or 3 rules trying to do the same thing, maybe one will accomplish the goal. And that's often an example where you can find that line between necessary regulation and red tape.
Merci. Je voyais aussi des entrepreneurs qui...
Thank you. Some entrepreneurs said that they don't understand why certain questions are asked in the paperwork, because that information should always be available to the officials through the Canada Revenue Agency or the commercial registry in Quebec. Is there not a way to reduce that paperwork on the department's end?
I think there is. I know in the past there's been some privacy concerns for people not necessarily wanting government departments to share information, but I think that's an area where we need to continue to advance and check in with Canadians, and appropriately, I think a lot of Canadians would be fine with sharing information if it were to simplify forms. We have to be careful about that balance between privacy, but I think that's an area certainly where things could be simplified.
Thank you. Mr. Backrack, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I like what Ms. Jones said about defining the regulatory objective. And one of the regulatory objectives around which there's a lot of regulatory development is the need to reduce climate emissions. And I'm curious about the Business Council's perspective on this, because we see 2 main approaches. We see a pricing approach, an attempt to send a market signal that will drive emissions reductions, and we see mandatory performance-based regulations. So in British Columbia, there's an zero-emission vehicle mandate. There's methane emissions. There's the building step code that I mentioned earlier. Which of these 2 policy tools does the Business Council feel should receive the most emphasis, assuming that the Council supports the objective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in line with our targets?
Yeah, of course. And in very general terms, the pricing approach would be preferred, but a pricing approach that is revenue neutral, and where we're taking the revenue from carbon taxes and putting it into tax reductions in things like income tax reductions, is the approach that we would in very general terms prefer. I think the worst scenario is to have the pricing and then layering on of regulations where sometimes there's duplication. We haven't considered the unintended consequences where we've got multiple different rules trying to do the same thing. So that's what we would want to avoid. And I think we have to balance it. We would say we want to balance that with making sure that Canadian exports remain competitive, because that's very important to our standard of living in Canada.
And then earlier you said that you accepted that, while much of the focus of this study is on increasing regulatory efficiency and removing regulations that are unnecessary, like the examples you provided, at times there is the need for new regulations to be developed. I wonder if you could give a couple examples of new regulations that the Business Council would support and feels are necessary.
Yeah, so I think that when you think about new, where you might be likely to have less regulation than is optimal, and would be in that lower kind of quadrant that we're talking about, that on the diagram I gave you, would tend to be in emerging industries. And I think that's where you get debate. So, when you think about things like how long it took to maybe put some regulations in place around vaping products or things like that, we're sometimes slower than we need to be with emerging products. And I would say where we're more likely to be over-regulated than under-regulated is in industries that have been around for a while. That's where we need to be modernizing our thinking, but it's those emerging products where we may be tending to under-regulate. And again, I think regulatory excellence provides a really good North Star for it, and getting better at measurement also will help us more quickly identify where we are.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Bachrach. Before we get into committee business to discuss my stuff, Mr. Greco, Ms. Jones, thank you very much. Wonderful witnesses. Learned a lot, but there's a lot more we have to pick up on. Both of you mentioned various studies, reports, examples like Nova Scotia. Please, if you have any of those you wish to share with the committee, I welcome and encourage you to send them to our clerk. He will have them translated and distributed to the committee as part of our report. So I sincerely thank you. I'll dismiss you both, and hopefully we'll see you again, perhaps as we continue the study in the fall. So thanks very much. You are dismissed.
Thank you.
Yes, I will get you, Mrs. Block. Colleagues, just for the last couple days, Monday we've got the PBO for an hour, and then my intent and hope is the second hour, the PBO will be on the SUPs. Hope is the second hour. There was the Indigenous procurement motion that we had brought forward, I think about a month ago, the one that led to all of those documents. So we're going to discuss that a bit. The Wednesday, if we are sitting, and I think we will be, we have Minister Anand for the second hour on the SUPs. Minister Duclos rightly declined, as there are no SUP-As for PSPC. So we'll have Minister Anand for the second hour. So we'll probably start at 5:30. The shipbuilding study, the study that never, or the trip that never seems to end. I presented the budget at the liaison committee, and it was, unfortunately, both of them were shot down. So there will not be a travel for that. I do encourage you, though, several of us over the years have visited the shipyard separately. They are very welcoming. So we cannot do it as a group, but I would recommend you do that separately. And that, Mrs. Block, you had something?
I did, Mr. Chair. Given that we are in committee business, I do have a motion that I would like to put forward at this time, and the motion is as follows. And I do have it in.
Mr. Morantz? Sorry, Mr. Morantz? Okay.
And can you just, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, Mrs. Block.
Hold on a second.
I do have it in both official languages, and we'll distribute it now. And it reads as follows: that the committee hold at least 3 meetings to study the office holdings and real estate assets of the Government of Canada, and that the government invite PSPC officials, Treasury Board officials, and National Capital Commission officials to testify. And if I may, my motivation for moving this motion is really twofold. The first would be the recent decision by the government to have public servants return to their offices for 3 days a week. And what we are hearing in the public, the concerns that are being raised about office space for public servants across the country. And secondly, we also have the recently announced or the ongoing process of the government looking at converting government buildings into housing. And I believe that it's part of our mandate as OGGO to take a look at these things as Public Services and Procurement is the central purchasing agent and real property manager. It would be, I think, important for us to have a handle on what could be happening with those assets. And I know that we will likely not get to these meetings until the fall. But I thought that we should get this on the books so that when we return, we can actually begin this study looking into this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. Are we fine with this, colleagues? Mr. Kuzmirchuk?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask actually is this motion is in order by the clerk? I just wanted to ask that.
It is.
Oh, okay. And then I just wanted to actually ask for a suspension if we can just have my team and I can have a conversation about this because it's the first time that we're seeing this. And today we were looking at the modernization, the red tape reduction study. And so this is not really related to that. It came out of left field. And so just wanted to have an opportunity to actually look at it. So suspend.
We can suspend 2 or 3 minutes.
5 minutes would be great.
2 or 3 minutes. We are back in. Mr. Hardy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I perked up when I saw this motion, and even though I'm not a member of this committee, I have a real interest in where this motion could go. Okay. And where it could go is toward the issue of housing, because there's been a tremendous amount of discussion about, the use of federal buildings for housing. And in that regard, in my community of Surrey, there's been an awful lot of work done with the Rapid Housing Initiative, which basically involves taking an existing building and repurposing it for living units, and it's been particularly good for, low-income people or people who are just unhomed, if you will. And so one of the things that I would hope that if this motion is adopted and the study goes ahead is that, you look at the overall strategy for that, because the Rapid Housing Initiative itself, and there was something like $14 million invested in Surrey to make this happen, and, dozens and dozens of units resulted from that. But the other thing, and this is a caution, because it's very tempting to say, well, the government owns these buildings and it owns all this land. And we have a housing shortage in Canada. There's no doubt about that. Although in my community, they're building it like crazy. But a caution here is not to necessarily say that a piece of property or a building is going to be suitable for housing when you're looking at the overall urban development aspects of it. There's in our community, there's pieces of federal land that are out in the countryside. Yes, you can go in there and you could probably build on one. You could probably build, 300 townhomes, but they're a long, long way from public transit. They force people actually to have motor vehicles to get around, and that works against some of the, the community development aspects that, that I think we should be aiming for when we look at an overall and a very comprehensive 360-degree housing strategy. The other piece of that, of course, then goes to the issue of municipal zoning, because, and especially in British Columbia, we have not only municipal zoning, we also have the agricultural land reserve, which means to say that if you've got a piece of farmland, you can't just flip that over and build houses on it or a warehouse or anything else. So these are all kind of considerations that we need to look at if indeed, the intention of a motion like this is to go forward and talk about housing. So the disposition of public property for something that on the surface looks really good could turn out to be pretty messy when it got down to the local level, just simply because of these factors that have to be thought about as we go forward with something like that. That's it, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Kuzmirchuk? Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Vignola, then Mr. Kuzmirchuk.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. I don't think this motion is a bad idea. In fact, I think it's a good idea. in the sense that it touches on one of the mandates of our committee. That is, to study the real estate assets of the Government of Canada. That being said, currently, we have a lot of studies on the table. For some of them, we have interim reports. For some, we have not written reports at all. So we need to finish up something before we get started on something new. Sure, we finished the Canada Life study, but there's still a lot on the table. For example, McKinsey and the shipbuilding strategy. There's ArriveCan. And then there's regulations. And then there's, what's it called? Indigenous procurement. It was diversity in procurement, that was it. So, we have a massive pile of studies on the table, a whole bunch in franglais of studies that we still need to finish. I would like to put out the friendly suggestion, as someone who doesn't like confrontation. So I would like to suggest yes, but not now. Let's do it in the fall or in January. Let's at the very least finish up 1 or 2 current studies. For me, it is really important to know that the government's real estate assets are being used well. And certainly, housing is a current issue. It must be provinces and territories that govern housing rather than the federal government meddling in their affairs. But given the size of the study proposed and given the studies we have before us, I would suggest that we work on our current studies, clear off our workloads a little bit, and then during the next parliamentary session, we can come back to this topic and carry out a proper, professional, in-depth study of federal real estate, as well as how it is managed and all topics to do with it. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Kusmerchuk, and then Mr. Backrack.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, as is often the case, I agree wholeheartedly with what Madame Vignola has stated. She is the voice of reason, oftentimes in this on this committee, and so what I wanted to say is, I agree wholeheartedly. We have a slew of studies that we've begun. We keep adding to those studies. We haven't really finalized almost a single one. That's the challenge. We're kind of, our average is quite low in terms of the ones that we've completed. Canada Post comes to mind, shipbuilding, McKinsey, ArriveCan, outsourcing, red tape, diversity in procurement. Am I missing? Procurement outsourcing. There's probably a dozen more that we started. We haven't finished. And so I agree. I think we need to focus our efforts on, I would focus our efforts on the tasks at hand. Let's complete those studies before we open up a completely new front. And I think it's important. I also think, just picking up on what my colleague had also stated, that on the issue of housing and the issue of converting
looking at office holdings and converting it into housing, for example. The HUMA committee has already done 2 studies. I think they're on their 3rd housing study actually in the last year. The HUMA committee completed, I believe completed a study on the financialization of housing, where they looked at housing from a number of different perspectives. They had 29 witnesses. They had 41 briefs studying the housing issue. They're conducting right now, as we speak, a federal housing investment study. So looking at all the ways that the federal government can make investments and change policy to maximize housing. And again, so HUMA, I think, is, if you're talking about housing, HUMA is the place to talk about, in terms of federal surplus lands and converting that into housing. It really belongs in the HUMA committee. It doesn't belong here. It belongs in the HUMA committee. And in terms of the work of PSPC, as I understand it, I think PSPC and Treasury Board is working on, looking at inventory of public land holdings and working on a management plan or a strategic plan. And so I think moving this motion today, again, I wholeheartedly agree with what Madame Vignola has stated, that it is premature. And so for that very reason, I move that we adjourn debate.
Mr. Clerk, you had the vote out already. I think we'll do a recorded vote, colleagues.
Mr. Hardy. Mr. Baines.
Yes.
Mr. Johari.
Yes.
Mr. Kuzmiuchuk.
Yes.
Mr. Souza.
Yes.
Ms. Block.
No. No.
Mr. Morans.
Excuse me.
Nope.
Ms. Kuzi.
No.
Madame Vignola.
Exceptionnellement pour.
Mr. Backrack.
No.
Okay. Yeas 6 and nays 4.
So we are adjourned, that motion is adjourned.
It's to adjourn debate.
No, the debate, yes, the motion. Yeah, yes. Mrs. Vignola, I saw your hand up, then Mr. Backrack.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have a motion to propose. Give me 2 seconds. I'll get it from my staff member. If you haven't received it, you should get it shortly. It is worded as follows. As pertains to the committee's study on government contracts with McKinsey, that the committee invite Kevin d'Entremont and Gregory Weinberg from McKinsey Company to appear. The Deputy Minister of PSPC, Deputy Minister of the Treasury Board, the President of the Canada School of Public Service, or the Director of Pedagogical Services, someone in charge of business culture within the public service, and finally, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, for a maximum of 4 meetings of 2 hours at the reopening of the House of Commons in September 24, to be allowed to hear the witnesses. You will notice that this motion very much resembles the one moved by my colleague, Ms. Kuzi, on Monday. It is similar, but a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more focused, and it has the goal of moving along the study of McKinsey and consulting services. This will prevent us from getting a surfeit of witnesses who might not all be able to answer our questions. Of course, the goal of this committee is to get answers to our numerous questions. So there you have it. This is the motion I am suggesting so that we can move forward with the McKinsey and consulting services study.
Thank you, Mrs. McNola. I assume because it's taken out a lot of the more disagreeable things from the other motion that you have talked to the others, so I appreciate that. So wish to speak on this? Is this something we just get to a vote right away? Mr. Bacharach, did you want to talk on this? Okay. Yeah, if we're all in agreement, we are agreed. Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Bacharach?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wonder if we might just have a brief conversation about which studies we intend to fully complete and table reports for. I can speak to the study that we brought forward on rural postal service. I would very much like to see a report tabled in the House with recommendations. But I'm not sure. It seems like some of the other studies are more open-ended and have continued for many months. And I understand that this committee doesn't necessarily produce reports for every study. So I'm just curious because I would like to pick up the Postal Service study, and you and I had a sidebar conversation about holding one more